Zeit Online Germany. I'm also a vice president of the Global Editors Network. We have a slight change in our program now. This next session is supposed to be about The Guardian, one of the world's most innovative newsrooms at this time. But Alan Rusbridger unfortunately was not able to attend today. We tried to arrange for a Skype appearance, but he really is occupied with attending to the Leveson inquiry, which is the result of The Guardian's outstanding work to a large part. He sends his greetings, but we have 4 very high caliber colleagues of The Guardian here for our panel. Before that, we have the great fortune of hearing another very interesting keynote by Wadah Khanfar. Wadah Khanfar is a veteran of journalism, even though he's still in his early 40s. He started as a war reporter, became the Baghdad bureau chief of Al Jazeera, and then from 2003 to 2011 served as the director general of Al Jazeera. And many of you might have noticed during the beginning of the Arab Spring and last year that there were really 3 major English-speaking news organizations that did outstanding work, especially in live blogging, live coverage, and also curation of social media. I remember The Guardian, the BBC, Steve Herman is here as well, and other colleagues from the BBC, and Al Jazeera, which then also did outstanding coverage of Fukushima as well, which showed us the power of this newsroom that many had not noticed yet before. Wadah Khanfar will speak about Syria, a very bitter, very dire topic. He will speak to us about what media can do about Syria, how we can cover a crisis of which we have oftentimes so little information, because Bashar Assad, the former eye doctor, very well knows that it is difficult to report about things that we don't see, and he and his ruling colleagues make sure that we don't see much of Syria. Wadah Khanfar, please welcome on stage.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak about Syria. And I'm going to speak about what media might have to do and what media must not do as well about Syria. Why Syria in particular? Because I think all of us are realizing at this stage that the Syrian situation that has, during the last few days, produced to us images of slaughtered children in Al-Hola in Syria, and the reluctance of the international society to address the issue of Syria in a manner that could swiftly end the suffering of the Syrian people and lead to a democratic transformation into Syria, the complexity of the regional politics around Syria, and as well the confrontation between what is seen as 2 major blocs that has emerged recently regarding Syria, but of course might become something much more wider than that, because Syria is seen as the fault line between 2 international blocs, Russia, China, plus of course Iran, Iraq, and maybe some part of Lebanon on one side, but on the other side you will have as well the international society with most of the Arab countries. So the complexity of Syria is a challenge to us in media. We have been used to cover incidents, wars, and conflicts in a way that all of us have realized certain rules and ethics of coverage. I have covered the war in Afghanistan myself and the war in Iraq as well, and many other confrontations in Africa and wars and so on. But in the case of Syria, the complexity actually is by far much more important in challenging a lot of our conventional wisdom and our established thoughts and ideas about media. To start with, I would like to argue, and this is my own observation, that media, national media and domestic media, tends usually to take the narrative of the government of the land that it is reporting from into consideration in international politics. Some media might confront government, local government, on issues related to the way that government is running domestic politics. But when it comes to international politics, most of the time, we tend to a degree or another embrace and accept the narrative of the government and the state that we are located in. That is, in fact, one of the observations that I have noticed in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Africa, in many other parts of the world. Since we may not have the right tools of accessing international conflicts sometimes, we tend to follow what spokespeople of our government or our army is telling us about that particular conflict. In the case of Syria, for 18 months, the international society has failed to address the issue of Syria and to put an end to the suffering of the people. And this led to more deterioration and more chaos within the Syrian scenario, but also within the region. When the revolution started, we did not have access to the field. During the first 3-4 months, most of our cameras were shut off. Al Jazeera, one of them at that time I was the Director General of Al Jazeera, but also most of the international outlets were not allowed to travel to Dar'a, where the revolution started, or to Hims or to Hama, and to cover the story from there. So we were confronted by the following issue. We are absent. Our cameras are not there. Our professional journalists have no access. The only thing that was available for us is what social networks could provide us with. So activists on the ground, who are basically, most of the time of course, are anti the regime, provided us with images and pictures of mass demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations demanding freedom and democracy. The first few days. Then major news outlets started picking up the story. At the beginning, reluctantly, because we did not know to what extent these demonstrations are in fact representing the masses and representing the majority of the Syrian people. So for the first 5 weeks in particular, we felt that we are still trying to figure out what do we see in front of us. Most of the people are protesting because of their suffering under a dictatorship, but at the same time they have not yet reached the point of demanding the overthrow of the regime. And the sources are actually from activists. Now, when you say sources from activists, it means that we may not authenticate, accurately, exactly the details, the numbers and figures. We did not have by then live broadcasting from the field. So social networks could not succeed in live broadcasting demonstrations from most of the Syrian territories. So what we will receive videos that are actually recorded or pre-recorded. This is a narrative. So the narrative of the public was generated through social networks. There was another narrative generated by state-owned media. State-owned media in Syria adopted another narrative saying that there are terrorist organizations and there are groups that are serving the foreign interest in Syria, are trying to destabilize the security of the country. And on a daily basis, they will in fact bring some people to testify in front of the screen saying that they have been recruited either by Israelis or by Americans or by Al Jazeera, by the way, in order to destabilize the country and to spread rumors about the regime and to create some kind of chaos in the country. This kind of scenario that the state started generating was also supported not only by people who testify in front of the camera, but also by using some of the material that a TV station like Al Jazeera and others are broadcasting about Syria and proving to the people, to the audience, that it has been forged. So we were accused then of forging news and videotapes and using them against the people of Syria rather than describing the events on the ground. We were reluctant at the beginning, as I said, and we were scared as well. Some of these pictures could be fake because you have not shot them. and you don't have an official presence on the ground because the government has decided to actually stop everyone from reporting from within the country. But in 99% of events and news and video clips that we received, actually we found later on that it is accurate. And there is no doubt of the authenticity of events that are happening on the ground. We might have some kind of issues related to accuracy. In a way, some people might say that today 75 have been killed, but they were 70, not 75, or 80, and so on and so forth. But when you speak about the picture of a country going into uprising or a revolution, no doubt that the general features of the story were true, and at the same time were describing the core issues and parameters of what is happening on the ground. This is why I say social media that was tested in Egypt and in Tunisia before that has proven not only vital, but also proven much more sophisticated and much more accurate in Syria. Because those people who collected data for main newscasters actually started to learn from their predecessors and from other revolutions. In a tape that Al Jazeera broadcast about soldiers stepping on some detainees and trying to, put their, feet on their heads and so on, and torturing them on the ground, the government of Syria said that this tape that was broadcast by Al Jazeera was shot in Iraq a few years ago. So it has never happened in Syria. Activists who shot these images went next day to the same town, and they did prove to the audience that the location of these images actually happened here by shooting the windows and the surrounding buildings and showing them in another tape where proves that the first tape was authentic, and interviewing people from the same village that actually went through that kind of torture, who proved that they, in person, by their faces, they are actually present in the previous tape. So they have started to learn incidents, to learn how to authenticate and to prove and to make it known to the public that it is accurate. So that was a great challenge that I think they succeeded in. Moving forward, after this phase of proving that there is a revolution and people are tortured and killed by the Syrian regime, moving forward, the regime started to be a little bit much more sophisticated in the way they are discussed. They acknowledge that there are protests, they acknowledge that people have their own demands, but they are also saying that Al-Qaeda are sending their terrorist members inside the country to create certain kind of attacks against civilians and against the people. Believe it or not, that the last massacre that took place in Al-Hula, and I don't know to what extent did you see the images of Al-Hula as I did personally, and I made a point of looking at these pictures, although maybe if you look at them you might not sleep that night, because I don't know how many of you did see slaughtered children, 2, 3, 4 years old children who were slaughtered in front of their mothers. 4, 5 boys slaughtered in front of their mothers before they slaughter here. That happened to 100 civilians in a village called Al-Hula. 100 kids and women. Where are the men? We don't know, because the men were actually kidnapped in order to be tortured in another location to extract information, while women and children were slaughtered. So that kind of incident, the regime said that terrorist organizations committed this massacre. And they failed to explain to us how could a terrorist organization go into a village besieged for days by the military, commit a massacre like that, then succeed to escape from the checkpoints and the siege of the Syrian military and to leave. The witnesses who have been so far alive, some of them escaped, told us accounts of horror of that night when a Shabiha invaded the city or the village and they started rounding up children and women and slaughtering them and killing them in front of each other. Now, international media, when we are projecting this kind of incident in particular, we have been talking about terminology that puts us in a gray area. So instead of a clarity of vision about what's happening in Syria, a regime slaughtering the people, using militias undercover to go and to kill and to, protect and to project to the world that these are terrorists. Instead of us having that kind of clarity, we started talking about or repeating statements for international spokespeople, UN envoys, and sometimes particular governments of a third party in Syria killing the people. Third party in Syria doing this and that. Then after that, we started speaking about accounts that are not authenticated, images that we cannot officially authenticate about people who have been killed. And this kind of gray description of events, in my opinion, is serving the regime of more and further killing on the ground, of claiming that what is happening is vague. Since we don't have our own correspondence, we don't really know who is killing who is doing what. It is messy, it is complicated. It is not as messy, as complicated as we know. There is a regime that is killing the people. The speech that we have heard from international figures, from the Americans, the United Nations about this particular incident, definitely everyone condemned it, but without putting the responsibility on the regime and making the regime pay for it and prevent the regime from further massacres, which they committed, by the way, in the following 3-4 days. Until last night, we had more than 80 people killed. I think we are serving the cause of the regime, of continuing that gray area of description. I understand that there are ethical responsibilities on us as journalists. And also I understand there are professional necessities. But I would like to ask all of us, when ethical responsibility is so clear and obvious, to what extent we should try to click to certain kind of necessities, professional sometimes, in order to maneuver within gray description of events. For now 18 months of killing in Syria. During these 18 months, the international society was reluctant. Media as well was reluctant. Yes, some of us were brave enough to send correspondents into Syria. And some of our great correspondents, international and Arab correspondents, did die in Syria, trying to narrate the story. And by the way, all professional correspondents who did access Syria did not narrate any story that contradicts what social networks and activists have been telling us for the last 18 months. So it means that the story altogether is true. The killing is happening. But does it really make big difference if the people who died are 10,000 or 10,250 or 10,990? What matters is to stop the killing. The last point here I would like to drive our attention in media is to look deeply at the political and geopolitical map of the region. With the rise of the Chinese and Russian way of thinking about Syria, in order to defend their sphere of influence against what is seen as pro-Western democracy, in my opinion, there is also a rise of regional system in the region. Syria is affecting what's happening in Syria, and the reluctancy to sort out what's happening in Syria is spilling out into Lebanon. And very soon, watch what's going to happen in Iraq as well. The Iraqi politics is in fact collapsing at this stage, and the alternative could be a civil war out of what's happening in Syria again. So you may have Iraq, Syria, Lebanon joining in some kind of violence and chaos. That is a scenario which, in my opinion, again is a result of international reluctancy and again a result of our own handicap of describing things as they're supposed to be and putting facts in front of the public as they're supposed to be. I hope that we will adopt a scenario about Syria that will be not only professionally and ethically sound, but also at the same time should question international politics and question our own government of their policies on Syria and what they have done to stop and to end the suffering of the people. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wadah Khanfar, for giving this speech with about 30 minutes prior preparation. I'd like to take another 5 minutes here with you so that you can also ask questions to Mr. Khanfar. There will be microphones. Please raise your hand so that we can find you. And while you gather your thoughts, I will ask one question myself. Mr. Khanfar, I've met you now, I think, 3 times at the last Global Editors Summit in Hong Kong and in Perugia. And one thing I noticed about you also in watching speeches of yours on YouTube is that even though you have seen so many of your colleagues dying, you seem to be a very warm-hearted person, and you're not bitter. Passionate but not bitter. What makes you hopeful, and what makes you hopeful about the future of journalism with all its shortcomings that you have just outlined?
I think people, the ordinary people who are thankful to anyone who helps them, the people who have warm thoughts and ideas about anyone who would like to serve them, that is important. I always argue that if journalism is dissociated from a mission, it is in fact part of the killing machine. Journalism always should be ethically centered, and journalism always should put the human being, the ordinary human being, at the center. Not centers of power, not corporate funding, not corporate money making, but actually the human being. So the mission and the people keep us running.
Mohammed Al-Harithi from Saudi Arabia. I just want to ask you, Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya coverage of the Syria, are they based on professional standard, or they're influenced by the government who financed these 2 channels? Thank you.
Thank you very much. When we started at that stage, of course now I don't speak on behalf of Al Jazeera because I left 8 months ago, and therefore Al Jazeera has its own people who speak on its behalf. But I would like to say, during the phase that I was in Al Jazeera, in my opinion, what we were trying to do in Syria in particular is to balance our story by having our own professional teams on the ground. But we were actually kicked out from every single location. Not only that, people who used to work for Al Jazeera, like anchors and the presenters, some of them, their houses were burned down. Some of them, their families were arrested. Some of them were banned from going back to Syria. So they put us under heavy pressure. The only way that we could have covered the story is, in fact, to go and to have activists and social network bloggers providing us with images. In fact, that, in my opinion, is necessary to do. It is necessity, not choice. And I think Al Arabiya as well, they have the same problem with Syria, and most of the international broadcasters have the same problem with Syria. It is the Syrian regime fault of not allowing media to go into the country and to have accurate and balanced reporting where their point of view could be represented.
There's one more question behind.
Sorry?
We can't hear you. Asking about the influence of government again. I think the question has been answered as much as we can in this session right now. I'd like to give the other gentleman the opportunity to ask his question.
I'm from Pakistan. I'm a journalist from Pakistan, Ziauddin. When dictatorship is bad, Assad is a dictator, oppressor. But why should we believe the media, Western media, which went along with the WMD facade in Iraq, which is totally wrong? Why should we believe the Western media that what is happening in Syria is, in that Bashar is wrong?
In my opinion, we journalists should never take any official story as it is without questioning, regardless if it is the American story about weapons of mass destruction or any other government trying to describe its own action or justify its own action. And it is one of the main challenges, how to draw the line between what is political and what is actually beneficial for our audience. We need to convert data that we collect into knowledge, and that cannot happen unless if we have our independent approach to understand the reality. We need to isolate ourselves and to make a barrier between international interest, national or political interest and our media activities. That is necessary not only in the case of what happened in Iraq, but also in the case of what's happening right now in the Arab world, the Arab Spring, in the case of how media in Egypt is dealing with the transformation, or the media in Syria and in Tunisia after the Arab Spring as well. So that is a question that will continue with us forever.
One last question from the lady back there, and then we will continue with our colleagues from The Guardian. Please.
Paul Islea, Russia Today. I'd like to know what happened. A number of Al Jazeera's staff walked out and resigned in your Beirut office. They said that they were under internal pressure in terms of how they covered the story in Libya and in Syria.
Actually, we had 3 people in particular out of 3,500 who did walk away out. 2 of them are Lebanese who have started talking about Al Jazeera coverage of Syria in particular. Libya, I've never heard of anyone resigning because of Libya, or anyone resigning because of Egypt, or anyone resigning because of Tunisia or Yemen. The only confrontation that we have in the region at this stage, unfortunately, is becoming sectarian. And we have a lot of problems emerging within newsrooms and within TV stations all over the region about who is with and who is against what's happening right now in Syria. This is why I said the Syrian situation is much more complex than what happened before that in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Yemen.
Wadah, Khanfar, thank you so much. Will you be around this afternoon for more questions to be discussed in person? Will you be around, Wadah? Thank you so much. All the best to you.